The night shift at the old warehouse. It was my third week working the overnight shift at an old warehouse just outside of town. The building was large, cold, and largely empty, filled with the smell of dust and industrial machinery. The company I worked for had recently rented the space to store surplus items. Mostly old furniture, machinery parts, and whatever else people needed to get out of the way. My job was simple: monitor the security cameras, do occasional rounds, and make sure nothing went wrong. I worked alone from midnight until the morning shift arrived at 6. The first few nights had been uneventful. The building was mostly quiet, save for the hum of the lights and the occasional noise of something shifting in the dark corners. But that was to be expected. The place was old, built sometime in the 1950s, and it creaked and groaned as it settled. I had learned to ignore it. But things started to get strange on the fourth night. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I heard the first sound. At first, I thought it was just the usual creak from the beams in the ceiling, or the wind rattling the windows. But this was different. It was a soft shuffle, like someone was walking through the aisles of the warehouse, though I was alone. I frowned and glanced at the security monitor. The cameras showed no movement. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. I did my rounds, walking through the maze of aisles between the stacks of boxes and crates. The flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows that seemed to follow me. I wasn't scared. It wasn't the first time I'd worked the graveyard shift in an empty building. Still, I couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There was something about the atmosphere that felt wrong. As I was walking back toward the office, I heard the shuffle again. This time, it was louder. Like someone was moving through the aisle directly behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. No one. I could still hear the noise, though. It was coming from deeper in the warehouse. Slowly, I walked toward the sound, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. I turned a corner and froze. A figure was standing in the middle of the aisle, just at the edge of the dim light. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. He was tall, with broad shoulders, but his face was obscured by shadow. He wore a dark coat and what looked like a wide-brimmed hat, though it was hard to tell for sure. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him, unsure if I should speak or run. My mind was racing. Was this a prank? Was someone playing a joke on me? But I hadn't heard anyone come in, and I was sure I locked all the doors. I opened my mouth to ask if he needed help, but before I could say anything, he stepped forward. And then, he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next, there was nothing but empty space. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, suddenly feeling the full weight of the silence that hung in the air. I ran back to the office, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to think. I pulled up the security cameras again, hoping for some kind of explanation. There was nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone in the aisles where I had just been. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe it was just fatigue, the loneliness of the shift getting to me. I tried to convince myself of that, but the image of the figure, standing in the shadows, wouldn't leave my mind. The next few nights, I became more paranoid. Every creak, every shuffle, sent my heart into overdrive. I started hearing more sounds, footsteps, whispers, doors creaking open. But every time I checked the cameras, or did a sweep of the building, there was nothing. No one was there. Then, on the sixth night, it happened again. I was walking down one of the long aisles, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I reached the end of the aisle and turned the corner, and that's when I saw it. A door that had been securely locked just hours ago was now wide open. I was sure I had locked it before leaving, but now, it stood ajar, as if someone had opened it while I wasn't looking. I cautiously stepped toward it, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the old wooden door. The hinges rusted with age. I hesitated before entering. The room behind the door was pitch black, but I could feel something. A presence. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I was too curious. I stepped inside, the air cool and stale. My flashlight flickered and buzzed, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then, I heard it. A low, guttural sound. Almost like breathing. I froze. It was coming from the far corner of the room. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something, or someone, was there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I took a slow, shaky step forward. I reached out with my hand, and as my fingers brushed the wall, I felt it. Something wet. Warm. My stomach turned. I pulled my hand away quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't leave fast enough. I rushed back to the office, my breath coming in short gasps. What the hell had just happened? What was that sound? And why was the door open in the first place? I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in. Somehow. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something wrong with that place. Something that went beyond just old walls and creaky floors. The next morning, as I was about to leave for the day, I passed the front desk. My coworker, who was starting the day shift, looked at me curiously. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said with a grin. I hesitated, not knowing if I should say anything. "I think I might have," I replied quietly, my voice trembling. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, but the unease I felt about the warehouse was still there. Something had changed in me after those nights. I no longer felt safe in that building, no matter how many hours I worked there. "Never mind," I said, forcing a smile. "It's probably nothing." But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me, lurking in the shadows of that old warehouse, waiting for the next night. The silent watcher. I used to work the graveyard shift at an old warehouse in the industrial district, a job I took after high school to pay the bills while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. The warehouse was situated at the edge of town, isolated and often surrounded by an eerie silence, especially at night. The building had been a part of the city for decades, initially a factory that had shut down years ago. Now, it was being used for storage by a company that specialized in industrial goods, and my job was simple: walk the floors every few hours to make sure everything was secure. It was a job that didn't demand much, which is why I never thought much about the rumors. Everyone in town had heard the stories. The warehouse was said to be built on land that once housed a military hospital during World War II. There were whispers about the site being the location of several untold deaths, mysterious disappearances, and strange occurrences. People who'd worked there before had claimed to see shadows moving in places where no one should be. Some said they'd heard voices echoing through the long, empty halls at night. It was hard to ignore these stories, but I was young and eager to earn a paycheck. The weirdness, I thought, was just old people's tales. The first month of my shift passed without incident. I'd walk the warehouse, check the locks, and make sure no one had broken in. But one night, something happened that I couldn't easily dismiss. It was 3 a.m., the usual time I began my rounds. The building was completely empty. There were no staff, no deliveries, and nothing out of the ordinary. As I walked through the aisles of stacked boxes, I approached an old storage room near the back of the warehouse. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and I had to squeeze through to check if everything inside was secured. As I stepped inside, the air felt colder than usual. It was like the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. I chalked it up to the aging ventilation system, but the chill didn't feel normal. It felt wrong. I turned the light on and began scanning the room when I noticed something strange, faint drag marks on the floor, leading toward the far corner of the room where the storage shelves stood. I froze. The marks weren't just dust being pushed around by the wind, they were deliberate. Heavy, as if something or someone had been dragged across the concrete. My first instinct was to leave the room immediately, but something kept me standing there. I didn't know if it was fear or curiosity, but I slowly moved closer to the corner. That's when I saw it. A door that had always been closed and locked was wide open. I had been inside this room countless times before, and I was sure it had never been left open. My heart began to race. I knew I needed to call the manager, but something inside me told me not to. Maybe it was the isolation or the late hour, but I had this unshakable feeling that if I called for help, I'd only be inviting more trouble. As I backed away from the open door, I heard it, a faint, distant sound, almost like whispering voices. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but there was no one around. Just the cold, empty space of the warehouse. The voices stopped as soon as I moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I quickly finished my rounds, locked the door, and returned to my office. The rest of the night went by without incident, but I couldn't get the image of the open door and the strange marks out of my mind. The next night, I was on my shift again, this time more alert, more aware of the eerie presence in the air. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of footsteps. I quickly looked around the empty warehouse. Nothing. The footsteps continued, echoing from the far end of the building. I hesitated, wondering if someone had snuck in. But I couldn't see anyone. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the noise. The steps were growing louder, but still no sign of movement in the aisles. As I passed one of the back rooms, I saw it, a dark figure, like a shadow, crossing in front of me. I gasped and rushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the spot, there was no one. The place was empty, not even a footprint in the dust. That's when it hit me, something in the warehouse was not right. I had heard enough stories from other security guards about strange occurrences, but until that moment, I had never believed them. I started to realize that I wasn't just dealing with old pipes or creaky floors. Something else was there. Something I couldn't explain. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as the night dragged on, I could feel eyes on me. I heard whispers again, softer this time, like someone was calling my name. Every time I turned around, there was no one there. Around 5 a.m., I was outside for a break when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. At the far edge of the parking lot, there was a figure standing by the shadows. It wasn't close enough for me to make out any details, but it was clearly watching me. My heart skipped a beat as I hurried back inside the building. When I looked through the glass doors, the figure was gone. I felt uneasy for the rest of my shift, constantly looking over my shoulder, hearing strange noises, and catching glimpses of movement that shouldn't have been there. By the time my shift ended, I was relieved to leave. I didn't know if I'd ever come back. As I handed over my badge to the morning security guard, I asked if anything unusual had happened during the night. He looked at me with a blank expression and simply said, "Same old stuff. You're not the first one to feel it." I never went back to that warehouse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me there. And as much as I tried to rationalize it, I knew deep down that whatever it was, it wasn't human. The warehouse stood empty for weeks after I left, until one day I saw a "for sale" sign outside. I never found out what happened to the building. Maybe someone else took the job after me, or maybe the warehouse was left to decay in silence. But every time I drive by that building, I can't help but wonder what still lingers inside, waiting for the next person to make the rounds. Whispers from the past. I had always known that the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town was a little strange. It was a relic of a bygone era, left to decay for years, far from the main road. The locals called it Holloway's Farm, after the family that once owned it, but nobody really knew what had happened to them. Some said they left overnight, vanishing without a trace. Others said the Holloways had been driven out by something far worse than just poverty or time. Over the years, the farmhouse had become a shadow in the town's history, the kind of place you'd whisper about but never actually talk about. It wasn't until my summer job that I got to know it up close. I was 20, a college student in need of some extra cash, when I took a night shift job as a caretaker for the property. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Gant, had recently inherited the land. He was well into his 70s and had no interest in maintaining the property himself, so he hired me to keep an eye on it. I didn't mind at all. I was used to working alone, and the pay was decent enough to cover my books for the upcoming semester. The house was big, too big for one person to manage. It was 2 stories tall, with long hallways, creaking floorboards, and dusty furniture left behind by the Holloway family. The kitchen was large but unused, the dining room too grand for just one person to enjoy. But the most interesting part was the attic, a room that seemed to hold more than just forgotten things. My job was simple: check the house every few hours, make sure the windows were locked, the doors were secure, and the property remained undisturbed. The real challenge, though, was the silence. The house was so quiet at night that it felt like the world had forgotten about it. Sometimes, I'd sit in the dining room, the only light coming from the old lamp above, and listen to the stillness. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. A sound that somehow felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. At first, the job was uneventful. I'd walk the property, inspect the house, and leave. But as the nights wore on, I started to feel something was off. It was subtle at first, just small things that didn't quite add up. Like how the attic door would sometimes be slightly ajar when I knew I had closed it earlier. Or how, on occasion, I'd hear footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. I told myself it was just my imagination, the creaks of an old house settling into the earth. After all, what else could it be? But then, the whispers started. One night, while I was upstairs in the bedroom closest to the attic, I heard it, a soft murmur. Almost like a conversation. It was coming from above, from the attic. My first instinct was to chalk it up to the wind or the house itself making noises. But the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, as though someone was moving around up there, shifting things, muttering under their breath. I went upstairs, grabbing a flashlight from the table by the stairs. The hallway leading to the attic was long, and the air was thick with dust and stale air. The door to the attic was cracked open, just like the night before. I pushed it open, and a chill ran down my spine. The attic was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through a small, grimy window. The floor was covered in old boxes and furniture, discarded pieces from a different time. But as I walked further into the room, I could feel it. Something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy, with the kind of presence that you can't see but can feel creeping up behind you. And then, I heard it again, the whispers. But this time, it was clearer. "Get out," it hissed, the words cold and unmistakable. I froze. My heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I stood there, staring into the dark corners of the room, where the shadows seemed to twist and shift. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the shift walking around the house, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, trying to convince myself that it was just the stress of the job getting to me. But it wasn't just the whispers. The next week, while I was doing my rounds, I noticed something even stranger. The dining room, where I had always left the chairs neatly tucked in, was different. One of the chairs was pulled out slightly, as if someone had been sitting there. I checked the entire house for signs of an intruder, but there was nothing, no broken windows, no unlocked doors. It was just the chair. That night, I heard the footsteps again. It started in the hallway, then moved down the stairs. It wasn't the creak of the house settling. No, this was deliberate, heavy footsteps, just like someone walking through the house in the dead of night. I grabbed the flashlight, my heart racing in my chest, and crept to the stairs. The light flickered as I moved down, casting strange shadows against the walls. I could see the glow of the moonlight filtering in through the windows, but there was no one there. I made my way to the kitchen, checking every nook and cranny, but the house was empty. There was nothing, except for the feeling that something was waiting, just out of sight. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway to the living room, half hidden in shadow. It was tall, thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like the kind the Holloway family would have worn, a long coat and wide-brimmed hat. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. My blood ran cold, and I couldn't breathe. "Hello?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It just stared at me, its face obscured by the shadows. Slowly, the figure stepped back into the darkness, vanishing into the hallway. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, unable to move, until I finally turned and ran outside. The cold night air slapped me awake, and I forced myself to breathe, trying to calm the panic that gripped my chest. The next morning, I went through the house again, determined to prove to myself that I had imagined it. But when I reached the living room, I saw something that made my stomach churn. The door to the cellar was open. I had never left it open. I didn't go into the cellar that night. I couldn't. The thought of going back into that darkness was unbearable. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me. Every time I was alone in the house, I could hear them, soft at first, then growing louder, more urgent. "Get out," they would say, their voices like 1,000 faint murmurs overlapping. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I told Mr. Gant that I couldn't continue with the job. I was quitting. He didn't seem surprised, but he didn't argue. As I packed up my things and left the house behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the window. And as I drove away, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the attic, watching from the darkness. I never went back to that farmhouse, and I never spoke about it to anyone. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my room at night, I hear whispers on the wind. And I wonder if it's just my mind playing tricks, or if the Holloway farmhouse still waits for someone to hear its story. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.